to a certain degree, I miss cold weather. I go to colder countries with a lot of my holiday that I do have when I am able to actually travel. Yeah, but having summer a lot of times not necessarily a bad thing generally.
Okay, well, I think it's about time to start.
Can you hear me okay? So I just make sure you can hear everything I'm saying, okay?
Okay, yeah, well, we can hear it perfectly and we see the presentation. So it's our pleasure to have our speaker tonight, Christopher Parsons, who is an economics professor at the University of Western Australia's Business School. And this is, of course, in Perth, Australia. Chris is a development economist. His primary fields are migration and development. His PhD is from the University of Nottingham. And apart from doing academic work, he did quite a bit of consulting and also work in government service, serving as an economist at Her Majesty's Treasury for some period of time. Chris's paper tonight is on For FARC's Sake, Demobilizing the Oldest Guerrilla in Modern History. I'm amazed how many papers come out on Colombia. This is a great source of inspiration for institutional economists, cultural economists, development economists. And Dr. Parsons is following that trend. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Leonid, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for the invitation as well. It is a little bit late here. I have done my best to prepare my sleep pattern, so hopefully I should stay awake throughout. This paper, the title's changing a bit. We've been working on it for a few years with Juan Pablo, who's my PhD student, and also Mikel Jetta, who is a colleague here at University of Western Australia. And really, it's another paper that's contributing to a fairly recent literature exploring the various roles of propaganda, largely in conflict settings. So I just want to give you a little bit of just to tell you exactly what we're talking about, hopefully with a video that will work. And so I'll explain a whole bunch of other stuff about the paper later on, but the paper's really about how propaganda, our paper anyway, is about how, in contrast to other papers, is about how propaganda can be used to bring a civil conflict to not necessarily a close, but to speed up perhaps peace negotiations or to bring about peace, or how to actually end the civil conflict. And one policy later, a major policy of the Colombian government was to actually have a reintegration program, which is not in post-conflict situations or countries, it's not uncommon. I used to live in Sierra Leone, and immediately after the end of the conflict in 2001, 2002, I mean, the major effort of all the donors was to focus on the demobilization of the rebels to get them back into jobs. They offered money for AK-47s and things to be handed in. In Colombia, and Juan Pablo will correct me, but I think it's fair to say that across a range of public policies, Colombia, as a nation state, has implemented a number of somewhat unorthodox policies, from leaving Christmas presents in the forest for guerrillas to pick up, to trying to solve Bogota's traffic problem by dressing people up, well, by having clowns go around and actually mock and make fun of bad drivers, which, you know, culturally is a bit of an issue, but it led to a reduction in driving fatalities. In this particular instance, the Colombian government rolled out a reintegration program whereby rebels could come out of the jungle and be demobilized, receive protection, tertiary education, etc. But when they started rolling out the program, the uptake of the program was very, very little indeed. Very, very few people actually handed themselves in. So over a period of several years, the Colombian government rolled out a propaganda campaign whereby messages were played during football matches. And, you know, as an English person, you know, we love football, but, you know, Colombians are up there with a nation that is as passionate, if not more, about football than we are. Colombians watch football. And so the idea was that small messages would be played frequently throughout football matches. And so I just want to play you one example of one of these messages before I go into more about what we really do in the paper.
Claro, esto es de amarilla. Guerrillero, no se arriesgue más, miliciano, si va a apoyar que sea su selección, a su familia. Inicie ya una nueva vida. La desmovilización es la salida. Ministerio de Defensa Nacional.
So, yeah, there's a yellow card. And while there's just a very brief pause, the commentator comes on and delivers a message from the Ministry of Defense, encouraging people, FARC rebels or other rebels watching it to demobilize. And so this is effectively the program or the information campaign that we're going to analyze in this paper. Civil war affects a lot of people. 1 in 5 people on the planet have experienced hardships of civil conflict. I don't want to talk too much about this. I think we can all accept this. But what policies we can meaningfully implement in the absence of kind of a total military victory, there are many options available, and I suppose we're just going to investigate in more detail one specific campaign that was reasonably successful in leading to a more peaceful outcome, I should say, because after the I'll stop. Okay, sure. We don't like civil wars for a whole bunch of things. They devastate people's lives, health, living standards, etc. And part of the issue as well is the fact that Paul Collier's work shows that if a country has a civil war, they're very likely to slip back into civil war once they're actually conditioned on the fact that they had a civil war to begin with. And so our papers also speak into a way in which, after cessation of hostilities, that of a particular policy that can be enacted in order to actually bring around lasting peace. So just a little bit of background. Colombia has been in a state of civil conflict for at least the last 60 years or so. It is said to be the longest civil conflict in modern history. One could debate that in terms of the ongoing conflicts in Myanmar, but I think it's generally accepted that this is the longest civil conflict. It actually began in a period in the 50s called La Violencia, which is a period of partisan violence and civil conflict throughout Colombia, following the murder of then President-elect Jorge Gaitan. And in response to this bipartisan conflict across the country, what typically happened was that a whole bunch of self-defense groups were set up, typically amongst campesinos, poor rural farmers. And one of the groups that was founded that I'm sure most, if not everyone's heard of, is the FARC. They were founded in 1968, and they began as a self-defense group, leftist self-defense group, but they mutated into effectively, narco traffickers, kidnappers, etc., etc. The peace talks then began 2005, off the top of my head, finished in 2016, and a peace deal was signed. One of the motivations for writing this paper in the first place was that actually when the FARC came to the negotiating table with the government of Colombia, that they actually asked for these messages to stop, meaning that they were, in the eyes of the FARC leaders, the negotiating FARC leaders at least, that they weren't particularly happy with this policy, or the flip side is that this policy was actually proving successful in terms of moving towards suing for peace. So the Reintegration Program starts in 2003, my mistake, but it wasn't very successful initially, as I said. So what happened was in 2005, a propaganda campaign was run up until 2016. And so we have I'll get into that later, but during this propaganda campaign, there was 2 distinct periods in terms of the messages that were relayed. And we obtained the original contract signed between the media companies that produced these videos and the government of Colombia. But we can think of, just have in the back of your heads, because this will be important later, that the first period was very messages relating to the family, trying to appeal to the FARC's family identity, while after 2011, the messages were much more about national unity. We're all in Colombia together. We're all in Colombia, we can move forward together. So it's much more kind of messages of national unity. And I'll talk a lot more about that later. So Colombia plays 12 national games a year. So in our sample period, we have 176 games. These games are broadcast on radio and television. And the campaigns are not limited to the games, but we are examining basically the impact of the propaganda campaign delivered in the football matches and then the immediate response in terms of the demobilization of rebels that follow. Well, I suppose the first thing, unless you've met any Colombians in your entire life, is to question whether Colombians like football and whether they watch football or listen to the football, and specifically whether the FARC, who are there's many rebel groups in Colombia. We have the FARC, which is a leftist kind of guerrilla group, or that's what the narco traffickers on the left. You have the ELN, which are also a left-wing kind of Marxist narco trafficking group. Then there's other groups like the AUC, which is a right-wing paramilitary. I mean, Juan Pablo said more, from my reading, is more of a thuggish mercenary enterprise. And then there's a lot of other M19, lots and lots of, anyway, our focus is on the FARC. Here in the top right, we have a picture of two FARC negotiators during the peace talks, and they both wear Colombian national jerseys. In the bottom, we have some soldiers, and again, they're wearing the uniform. Actual fact, on the FARC uniform, they wear the national flag. We have lots and lots of anecdotes in the paper, or we have lots of anecdotes, some of which are in the paper. We're going to add more. Here's a quote from some sociological work we've been reading. When Colombia was playing Argentina, we were marching in the middle of the jungle, and one of the soldiers told us that the game was 5-0. So we stopped everything and took out our radios. And how do they listen? Typically, they listen by radio. So in a 45-minute presentation, I don't want to talk too much about the existing literature. I'd much rather spend the time talking about my paper, our paper. But needless to say that there's been a number of papers in the last 10 years or so that look at the impact of media campaigns, propaganda campaigns, whether that's in the context of Rwanda or former states of the Yugoslavia, the rise of the Nazi Party, or most recently, the Lord's Resistance Army paper in, so it's split between countries. So that's the literature we're trying to speak to. But all of these papers are effectively estimating long-run cross-sections. And typically, they have some radio stations, and they're looking at how the signal differentially affects different parts of the country, and they have some identification strategy based off long-run cross-sections. But that means that the existing papers aren't able to actually examine the dynamics of what's going on, and indeed what is actually driving these effects. We have, quite remarkably, administrative data. I should say, Juan Pablo is an extremely entrepreneurial PhD student and co-author, and without his entrepreneurship, we would have never got as far as we could. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we got the data from phoning up a colonel in the Colombian army who was very nice enough to give us the data. I might tell you another funny story as things go on. But we have 1,000 complete data on 1,122 municipalities, and we have daily data throughout the entire period over a period of many years. We then have 2 different messaging campaigns with very different messages. And so this plus a couple of other things I'll talk about later really allow us to dig down into the mechanisms. But before we talk about those, I want to, I suppose, present our main identification strategies on kind of the total effects of this media campaign on the demobilization of the FARC rebels. Briefly, in our period under study, 85% of the days fall within our messaging period. By messaging period, we mean propaganda period. On average, we see 3 FARC demobilizing every day over the period. And in total, it was around 17,000 FARC demobilized over the entire period. Only 3.5% of our days feature a game where the national team played. And later on, we're going to examine the timing of games within days, and only about a fifth of the games actually were played at dusk. And that's particularly important because it's at dusk that the FARC, as part of their daily duties, that's when they have their downtime. So that's going to form part of the foundation for our second identification strategy. Excuse me, I'm going to need coffee breaks. So before I show you any econometrics or try to persuade you that we've got a fantastic identification strategy, what happens if we just plot the average daily demobilization figures relative to the various periods of our study? So the left-hand point estimate here is where there wasn't a game yesterday, but it's outside the propaganda period. So it's around the mean. If we're outside the messaging period, but there was a game yesterday, again, we're seeing that the unconditional point estimate is around the mean. If there was within the messaging period, but there was no game the day before, it's marginally higher. But okay, I know this is just there's nothing fancy going on here at all, but just looking at the summary statistics, as it were, if there's within the propaganda period and there was a game the day before, then there's a really massive bump in the number of daily demobilizations. And so the rest of the paper, I'm really going to be digging down, the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be digging down into that. So we have three identification strategies in order to isolate the causal effect of messages on demobilizations. The first is the fact that the days on which games are played is determined by a combination of the regional football body, which is called I can't remember. They've all got terrible acronyms. Then realizing that that identification strategy might be mixing up days both within and without or outside the propaganda period, we're going to look at the differential of timings of games within days, while realizing that dusk games are played largely when the FARC have their leisure time. And then the third identification strategy is going to look at the impact of the messages on demobilizations when we have rain, because rain has a reflecting effect on these radio signals. And so we'd expect that, well, our hypothesis is that we'll have more demobilizations following games, but then that rainfall will act against that effect because it will be dampening down the radio signals such that fewer rebels in the jungle can actually hear these signals. CONMEBOL. Yes, my dyslexia had a field day with that. So basically FIFA assigns the international breaks, CONMEBOL arranges the schedules, and then the Football Federation of Colombia sets the actual days. So these decisions are taken completely orthogonally to anything that might be related to demobilizing. And so here we're interested in whether there's a game before, during the messaging period. So we're interested in this interaction effect here. And so with all of these estimations, we've got a whole bunch of fixed effects, day of the week fixed effects, month fixed effects, year fixed effects, municipality fixed effects, and municipality year fixed effects. In each estimate has standard errors in curly brackets as well as square brackets, and that's where we have clustered either the municipality either at the municipality level or at the municipality year level. But overall, we see that during the propaganda period, the day after a game is played, there's a significant bump in the numbers of demobilizations, and it's around 6. So on average, it's 3. But during the messaging period with the game the day before, it's about 6. And so it's about 3 times what we observe when there is not a game before during the messaging period. The second oh no, hello, it's gone the wrong way. Okay, the second identification strategy is relying on the fact that FARC rebels have their leisure time during dusk time, so we can differentiate between games played at other times of the day versus games played at dusk. And here, therefore, oh, sorry, we'd be interested in this beta 5, which is the interaction of being in the propaganda period and also a game played. And we see, which will be here, if you times this coefficient, which is an estimate that relates to a single municipality, and there's 1,122 municipalities. So if you times that up, we get to around 8 demobilizations during a dusk game relative to just under 5 during a non-dusk game. So those two identification strategies are just relying on the timings of the games, either relying on days within which day it is, or the timing of the matches within the day. Moving forward, we want to exploit time and geographical dimension, and we can do that through collecting quite detailed rain data. And we would expect there would be a reduction in the number of demobilizations the more it rains. And in parts of Colombia, I mean, it rains an awful lot. And overall, that's exactly what we find. We find the more it rains, the fewer demobilizations there are. And it's what's particularly heartening, actually, from my perspective anyway, is the fact that the coefficient on rain on its own is almost 0. And so that alleviates concerns that rain might be affecting travel times, and in turn, that might be driving the dynamics of our results. But the fact that we see on its own that rain doesn't really affect demobilizations is actually, for me at least, it's a heartening result. How long have I got left, please?
Sorry?
You still have like half.
Well, sorry, I muted my mic. You're doing fine. You have another 20 minutes, if that's fine by you.
Oh, it's perfect. I just want to make sure
perfect.
that I.
No, you're doing quite well. Thanks very much.
Excellent.
And the story is
being
fascinating.
a little bit early. I do mind being late.
Chris, your story is fascinating, so I lost track of time, but thanks for the reminder.
All right. Well, thanks.
Okay.
That's kind. Okay, so
if we can wrap up in 20 minutes, that'll be fine. Thanks.
oh, I'm definitely going to do that.
Perfect,
right. Okay. So, as opposed to estimating a long-run cross-section, we have daily data, and that allows us to do quite a lot of things. On the one hand, but on the other hand, we only have 176 games in our overarching data set. So one thing that we can do is just to see what, so 0 is the day of the game. And we see that when Colombia plays a football matches, demobilizations are lower than they otherwise would be. And the day immediately after the game is played, the demobilizations increase significantly, and then they peter off quite quickly down to 0. Another way of thinking about this is to think about retreatment. So if you estimate everything in a long run cross section, you lump everything together and you find out what kind of the total effect is. Insights from social psychology would suggest that actually, when you get delivered messages that are reinforcing one another, it'll have an additional effect, but the marginal difference will be declining. Now, we can only look at retreatment, as it were, with pairs of games. National games tend to be played in pairs. You play, Colombia at home, and then you play Colombia away. And so for those, we can get a sense of whether we do have this kind of retreatment effect by just focusing on those games that are played with the same two teams quite close together. And that's what we find. We find that the impact of the first game is largest, but there is a reinforcing effect of the second. I could run through a billion tables with you, but I think I could spend my time better elsewhere. We do a ton of robustness, and like every other paper in economics, we present no robustness checks that fail, but genuinely, we are quite convinced that it's a pretty robust result. We've tried alternative identification strategies, looking at differences. We've played a lot around with the rain data. We've looked at using Poisson models of various types. We've changed around units of measurement. We've got tons of different controls, which we can talk about. Well, I suspect that'll be when people ask questions, might have to tell them we've included a lot of control variables that you haven't seen. And we also run a lot of placebo tests. So as I'm going to go into the mechanisms now, I mean, the mechanisms are really pertaining to individual demobilizations as they compare themselves and their own identity with the group in which they find themselves, and they compare that identity with their former identity that they left, i.e. their family identity. So as a somewhat placebo test, we can see if these effects manifest where entire brigades, battalions, squads demobilize, and we find actually that's not the case. It's heartening. We don't see increases in demobilizations leading up to a game. And we also do a bunch of placebo tests. Placebos are a word that's overused in economics for all the wrong reasons, I think. So we do some falsification tests by randomly assigning the days of the games, the timings of the games. But for the rest of the talk, not least given your research group's interests, I thought I would dedicate the remainder to talk about what we think is actually going on here and why it is that we see these demobilizations when we do. So we have a fairly simple theoretical foundation, which I'll show you kind of more familiar way we think about in economics. But to begin with, I just wanted to briefly go through two big ideas from the social psychological literature, because that's going to then in turn inform how we kind of model this a little bit more formally. So maybe it's useful to have an Akerlof type and Cranton type model in the back of your mind when we talk about these things. But individuals join groups and they become members of those groups. And there's a lot of literature to show that they make intergroup comparisons between themselves and others. These comparisons can be positive, they can be negative. And these comparisons that one makes, and no academic should ever make comparisons with other academics, but yeah, there you go. Comparisons lead to self-image evaluations. And actually, if that self-image is sufficiently bad enough, people might actually leave or change groups. So negative comparisons may cause members to leave. And here we're going to talk about a family identity, because typically, a lot of members of the FARC are press ganged or forced to join the FARC. And it's not unreasonable to think, given that they largely recruit or solely recruit from fairly poor rural regions, that the initial identity that individuals have is that of their home with their family. When they then join the FARC, there is a separate group identity, and we're going to call that the FARC identity. So that's the first bit of foundation for our theory. And the second comes from elaboration likelihood model. And this is about one's emotional state. And given one's emotional state prior to receiving some information, that emotional state can determine in part how one responds to the information that one receives. So typically the literature that we're citing, they talk about messages that can make you sad, they talk about messages that can make you happy. In that literature, it is said that a happy state typically acts as a distraction, while a sad state actually signals that there's a problem to be solved, and the individuals actually lament the problem. And it leads to the conclusion that indeed sadness increases persuasion. So this is what we had in mind, but we're economists, so let's formalize this into a very simple framework. we are going to have a utility, and that is going to be derived from one's group's identity. So one is in the FARC because we are looking at demobilizing individuals from the FARC. So they can either remain in the FARC and have the utility from whatever they get from being a member of the FARC, or they can leave and pursue their alternative identity, which we think of as a family identity. And that is going to involve some cost. Without trying to be too brutal, if you leave the FARC and you get caught, you get shot. So, I mean, these costs are significant. And this beta captures the value that members attach to this other identity. In our case, the family identity, the identity these individuals left before being forced or otherwise to join the FARC. So we can beta bar here is the average of this distribution of beta, and we say there is some threshold amount B star beyond which members with their draw of beta will leave, because then their utility of leaving will be greater than the utility of staying. The reason beta star is really quite far into the right-hand tail of this distribution is because leaving has to be a fairly rare event, because the FARC have endured for many decades. So we link the realization of beta, or the draw of beta, however you want to think of it, to the intergroup comparisons made between members of the FARC, and they're comparing, they make an intergroup comparison between the group they currently find themselves in, the FARC, and their family that they've just left. So we posit that if there's a positive comparison related to the members' alternative identity, so the family identity, the further the beta will move to the right, and therefore the more likely it is the beta will pass the beta star threshold, and thus the more likely they'll be likely to leave or demobilize from the FARC. So that's the first bit. The second bit is pertains to thinking about individuals' emotional states. In particular, the state of sadness has been found or argued in social psychology to actually lead to persuasion having far greater effects. So in order to capture this idea, we are effectively changing, we have a mean preserving spread into the distribution of beta effectively, thereby changing how much density there is in the tail. So any draw from beta would be more likely to produce a beta greater than beta star, the sadder, or if we see individuals in a sad emotional state relative to a happy emotional state. So we can conclude, or we have a proposition, that FARC members are particularly likely to leave if they're both in a state of sadness and if they're being presented with positive elements of their alternative identity. Okay, we're getting there. So, I mean, this is just an example of a message. This is a family-related message. Rebel, your mum is telling you that she's waiting at home for you this month of the mother, demobilize. So that's the kind of family-related messages that we're talking about, reminding you of your family, reminding you of your past life, reminding you that you're loved by your former loved ones. And we're still toying about with what really to call the other messages, partly because they feature, I think it's fair to say, in every single one of them, a lot of people a lot of members of the Colombian army, helicopter gunships, all of these kind of things. But the actual messages delivered in these army featuring videos is very much more about we're all on the same team, we're all Colombian, you know, we're all in it together. And so for the time being, I'm calling these messages of, or for the sake of this presentation, I'm calling these messages of national unity. Okay, we're getting there. I think I'm okay for time. So the first thing is we're just going to look at the demobilizations comparing, remember there's two propaganda periods. The first propaganda period featured families, and the second one, basically messages of national unity, featuring a lot of members of the army. And we see consistently for the first identification strategy that family-related messages, remember that we argue, give for example, a positive comparison between the group you're currently in and the group that you have left, lead to more demobilizations. And this is also true when we look within days at games played at dusk versus games not played at dusk. In terms of our third identification strategy, we find that family messages actually, let me get this right, the right way around, have a more of a negative impact on those demobilized. I hope I've got that the right way around. Oh, Pablo says yes. Okay, good. Now, I think this is really interesting, but we still need to discuss it internally. But our paper is very much about the FARC. But as I said before, there is a lot of different armed groups in Colombia. And arguably, you have to be careful with my words here, but arguably the most similar one in terms of their philosophical and political beliefs is the ELN. In terms of they are a left-wing Marxist guerrilla group, they had more, I don't know, how can I say it? They were set up in good faith, but soon strayed from the path and became narco traffickers and did a lot of really bad things. But that's different from the AUC, who are right-wing paramilitary thugs who run effectively I mean, what's the right way to say it? They run a business. Is it fair to say that, Juan Pablo, they're more business orientated? It's more about the money and the kidnapping. If you pay them, they'll take stuff out. So they're less led by ideology, and they're more led by motivations of profit or self. Yeah, okay. So in terms of, if we look at the effects of these games between the family featuring and the kind of national unity messages, we find actually the same effect between the ELN and the FARC, which would give us confidence that they're actually, these individuals are going through a similar type of process of comparing their identity in the FARC or in the ELN with their home identity, but this is somewhat different for the AUC. I'll leave it there. Okay, now, and I will finish on time almost. If you're taking really careful attention, we're going to be arguing effectively that the first bit of the campaign, the family-related messages, had a really strong effect on demobilizations and was thus really effective, while the second part, the army-related, was actually not as successful. So why is it we moved from a largely successful policy to a largely unsuccessful policy? So one explanation for that is the fact that they weren't aiming to actually demobilize as many rebels in the second part of the propaganda period as to the first propaganda period. And in order to kind of show that and some work's been done on this, but they certainly may have wanted to be showing the Colombian army in a better light for a whole bunch of different reasons, not least because the Colombian government at times, I'm sure Juan Pablo will say yes, but yeah, they've been accused of doing some pretty bad things themselves. Sorry. So here what we do is we take the ratio of positive media attention, we take the most popular newspaper in Colombia is El Tiempo, and we take all of the issues of El Tiempo, and then we do a textual analysis where it features the word ejército, which means army, immediately after the games, and we do a text analysis to see whether they're positive mentions or negative mentions, and then we take the ratio of positive mentions between as a numerator during the army period, as a denominator during the family period, and we actually find that during the second propaganda period, there was, in terms of the mentions in the media about which the Colombian government have some agency, we see that the army was cast in a much more positive light in the second part of the campaign. So I suppose our argument is to say, yes, there is some reasons, we have some explanations for why it is that the second part of the campaign seems to be less effective. Okay, just a few things at the end. So we're thinking about different ways in which we can judge or not, whether a particular individual will be in an emotional state, a sad emotional state. And one way to look at this is to actually look at whether the games that they're watching were actually won by Colombia or lost by Colombia. So if we just look at the basics, actually following a game that the Colombian national team lost, the demobilizations go up quite significantly. This is the worst slide, and I apologize. And of the one thing I didn't get to do today, it's this slide, so forgive me. But this is basically just the same figure for the FARC here and the ELN here and the AUC here. But as opposed to just looking at whether Colombia won a game or lost a game, rather we look into the betting odds of what the matches were at the time in terms of whether Colombia were expected to win or expected to lose. And we see that actually in terms of our estimated coefficient of the impact of the propaganda campaign on demobilization of the FARC, an expected win, quite small, unexpected win, a little bit bigger, but actually it is the expected loss or the unexpected loss, i.e. if you're sad or if you're really sad, that actually leads to more demobilizations as well. And again, we see the same pattern with the FARC, we see the same pattern with the ELN, but not with the AUC. And we need to do a little bit more justification there. But this serves as somewhat of some external validity to our result, I suppose. Finally, we then think, well, what else? How else can we capture whether individuals are in a sad state or not? And there's another way is to look at different holidays. So we divide holidays into kind of family-related holidays, Christmas, Mother's Day, these kind of holidays, as opposed to national holidays, which would be like the independence of Cartagena or the Battle of Boyacá. Is that what you call it? Okay, thank you for that. It's getting a bit late. And again, we see that while state holidays basically don't have any effect at all, family holidays lead to additional demobilizations and following. Yeah, no, I'll leave it there. And nearly there. Then we can show the same for the different armed groups. And again, we see the same for the FARC and the ELN, not the AUC. And I think this is, yeah, last slide. And finally, it's not just that the Colombian nation as a whole have all their holidays, but the FARC actually have various days that they celebrate or otherwise themselves. Some they celebrate, or some they commemorate, but we will argue that every time there is a death of a prominent FARC leader, it is fairly reasonable to assume that the FARC on average will be sadder that day. And indeed, we find that in periods immediately after or the day after the death of a prominent leader, we also see an additional number of demobilizations. And so hopefully I'm about on time because I don't have much to say above and beyond that.
Well, Christopher, many thanks. That was quite fascinating. We have time for Q&As, please. Are there any questions and comments to Christopher Parsons?
I would like to start as usual.
Right.
So, well, thanks for the presentation, Chris. Well, you took the first question from my mouth in the last couple of slides, but about like the result of the game being influential or not, given that you mentioned this factor of sadness. But I have a related, well, first a clarification question, and then depending on that. So, do you include only kind of official games like qualifiers or World Cup games, or do you include friendly matches as well?
Good point. We've discussed this previously. Are they all in there, Juan Pablo?
At the moment, yes.
Or did we exclude?
At the moment, we include all games, all official games by FIFA. For example, there are some friendly games between Colombia and a Colombian club. We don't include those, but all FIFA games are there. So, for example, a friendly game between Colombia and Argentina will be there.
The first one is Colombia-Paraguay. Yeah.
Yes, the first one is actually Colombia-Paraguay. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, related to that, do you see any difference by the? Okay, like I understand that like after like Colombia loses a game, it's more likely that more people will demobilize. Does it matter the importance of the game? Because I'm thinking, okay, like if Colombia loses a friendly match against Argentina, they don't care too much, but losing on a knockout stage in the World Cup, then you will be really pissed off. And
yeah, I mean the terrible time that Colombia gets knocked out of the World Cup by England. I mean that's just the end of the world. Sorry, my job as supervisor is to talk about that a lot. I think the answer is that we tried it, but because we're dealing with quite a low number of observations in terms of the games, we don't have as clear-cut results as we would otherwise want to present. I think that's the case. It's one of the things we tried fairly early on. And we could show that there's a difference of an effect, but not perhaps a difference in effect that we want to show everybody. I think that's probably the honest answer.
mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
I think that was my question.
Bernardo, you're done?
That's it for now. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Please, any other questions or comments?
Sorry, I have another one also.
Okay,
please.
Bernardo,
Yeah,
can you pause for a second just to make sure that? Oh well, what's that?
More coffee for him.
Oh, this is more coffee.
Yeah. Okay. Well, looks like there is. Okay. Well, Bernardo, I'm sorry to have interrupted you. Please go ahead.
So, are there like any differences? I don't know, like after elections, depending on like which coalition won. Have you tried to explore this?
I'm not going to be able to give you a satisfactory answer, Bernardo. That's the truth. My understanding is that there was the two different messaging campaigns were in a function in part of the changing president of Colombia. If there is some, if we can exploit that dimension in order to look at some of the mechanism type things, I'd be keen to explore that. Juan Pablo, were there many changes in terms of you have quite long presidential terms, don't you?
Yeah, I think for this 16-year period, we only had 2 presidents.
Yeah.
So it's not like we can exploit this political shift that much.
And that, I suppose, manifests most in terms of the significant difference in terms of the campaign, right? Moving from family. Yeah.
They actually coincide. So the first president, Álvaro Uribe, I don't know if you've heard of him. He was the one who came up with this idea of having a propaganda campaign. And his period ended up in 2010. And then the Nobel laureate, Juan Manuel Santos, was the one who took over these campaigns. And he was the one of the idea, well, his government was the one who shifted the narrative of the campaigns.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Please, any further questions and comments? While we are waiting for those, gentlemen, if I may, excuse me, your empirics seems to be pretty strong. So my questions are mostly about your theory and motivations. And the idea to get involved, the identity change cost is a good one, I think. But wouldn't it be easier just to assume that demobilization involves some emotional costs and benefits in addition to material ones, and that probably generate the same results? More interestingly, though, is the observation that if people are sad, then it's more likely they will respond to these propaganda messages. And that makes sense, I guess. Although you mix 2 different types of sadness. One is that the national team lost a game, and another one that a guerrilla leader has been shot. The first one is kind of general mourning of the nation, right? And the second one is specific to a cause. So it's not quite clear to me why these 2 different types of sadness make someone more susceptible to propaganda messages. And when I think about why a sad person will be more likely to demobilize, what's common in these 2 cases, you have one of your commanders removed or your national soccer team lost, is that in such situations, probably people start attaching greater value to nice, quiet, private life, right? And you go back to basics. Okay, we've lost. So now I need to think what I can do with my life, and or my commander was killed, and same logic probably kicks in. Would that make sense to you? So why a sad person is more susceptible to propaganda? Maybe you want to elaborate on this. And you, if I may, Chris, one last question. You mentioned mean preserving spreads as a part of your theory, and I didn't quite get how mean preserving spreads and making this distribution stochastically dominant would contribute to your logic. If you can please talk about that a little bit.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to remember everything in one go. Broadly, my response is, in terms of your first part of the question, is something that I literally phoned. We had a conversation about this not too long ago. Is that we have the beta and we have the sigma squared, and they can change, but it's not clear to me, if I'm being honest. I mean, I believe if you're in a sad state or you receive family-related messages, you're more likely to demobilize, and I think we can show that quite robustly. It's not clear to me why one of those elements will affect the beta and or the sigma squared while another one will not. So effectively, some of those are mixed together as they currently are. Are we going to be able to do better? I'm honestly not sure, but that's completely valid. What was the second? Sorry, the other 2 points. One was about how you can say one stochastically dominates the other in terms of the mean preserving spread. I'm not sure we want to say one stochastically dominates the other per se. It's just another way of effectively shifting up how much density is in the tail of that distribution. So it's another way of saying, well, you're more likely to demobilize. I suppose the question back to you would be, I suppose what we're trying to weave together two separate strands of thought from social psychology. One about comparison of group identity. I think in economics that's quite well accepted with the models that are out there. And then we also have this kind of emotional state and sadness. And distinguishing between the two is somewhat problematic. Do we need to have both the sigma squared and the beta? I suppose we're trying to make the point that these two things are separate, and yet when it actually comes to talking about the mechanisms, we're lumping them together in terms of they both go the same direction, and that's where we're at. I'm hoping we can think of something clever to do a little bit better to distinguish between those two things. Your second question, I have forgotten, so forgive me.
Okay, well, never mind. It just occurred to me that there was a very popular Russian pop singer named Viktor Tsoi, who was an ethnic Korean, half Korean. He was extremely popular in French. It was a while ago, so maybe younger people in the seminar don't remember him, but some still do. And one of his most popular songs was "Я так устал на войне." I'm so tired of fighting a war, and I just want to go home, and I want to be engaged in my private life. So it might be, I don't know, just struck me that's kind of similar to your story. And
fair.
If at that time you get so he's apparently sad. Okay, he's tired. He's sick and tired of fighting a war, and the idea of going back to private life becomes much more appealing to him.
Much more, sorry, what?
Much more appealing to him, so it's much more appealing, yes. Much more amenable to.
Yeah, it seems to me there's two opposing forces. I mean, I was in Sierra Leone at the end of the war, and it was the worst war at the time in Africa. It was awful, and I could tell you awful things, but about
All right, well, let's.
But I suppose the point is that everybody there was so afraid of what had happened that they desperately, it's exactly what you said, they were desperate to get back to their family, they were desperate for peace. And the only thing that if you asked everybody, it's like, no more war, no more war. So you have that sentiment on the one hand, and actually in Sierra Leone, the population was so beaten down and demoralized, it actually led to, for the one African government being democratically voted out by a separate party. And that was the second time in the history of Africa that for all countries that had happened. But it's for me, so I agree with you completely. But on the other side, if you look at the civil wars reoccurring, and And we can think of other places like Central African Republic or whatever, Chad, etc. I mean, these countries are in civil war and then they just fall back in civil war the whole time. So I suppose we're trying to position our paper somewhat as one of the ways that we can move towards a peaceful solution.
Okay. Okay, well, any further comments, questions, clarifications, feedback, responses? I don't see any, so that means that we're about to wrap up. I would like to thank very much Chris and Juan for coming all the way virtually to present this very interesting piece of work. And Bernardo, I know the answer to my conventional question at the end, but please make it official.
Okay. Thank you, Chris, for staying so late with us. It was a pleasure to have you here. And I hope that you will be able to sleep despite the tons of coffee you had during the presentation. And
not anytime soon. But I must admit, I had to sleep this afternoon deliberately.
Okay, and okay, next week we have our chair, Leonid Polishuk. He will be presenting his joint work, which is titled Policy Responses to COVID-19 in Russian Regions. So that's going to be next Thursday, same place, same time. So hope to see you all here, and have a good evening and have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Thanks very much to everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Take care.
Much obliged. Cheers.
Cheers.